Thank you very much indeed. And it's, what are you doing? Oh, the water. I thought I was bringing something rather more serious. It is a real pleasure for me to be here today, and I feel something of a fraud, actually. I have nothing to say to you that is based on statistics or provable facts or learned exposés. You are at the moment, at the sharp end of this enormous big black hole that is facing this country, that has faced this country certainly for at least 2 decades and has been remarkably ignored by those people who are responsible for, on the one hand, funding it, and on the other, defining it for the rest of the country. Those appalling, unbelievable events that took place in Manchester on Monday have thrust the general election, quite rightly, into a kind of side alley so that the nation can attempt to come to some kind of terms with what was visited upon our children. And I have to say, I think the people of Manchester have given us the most marvellous example of how you do actually react. But before that terrible event, this problem of this big black hole of how do we as a country ensure that an ever-growing, ever-aging population can actually have lives that they can live and not merely exist within. And that has never, ever been as high up the political flagpole as it is now. And let's hope, let's sincerely all work, not just hope, that the country will actually take on board this problem and that there can be a genuine national debate on this issue, because it cannot be solved by dropping into that utterly pointless hole known as party political point scoring. That isn't how anything is genuinely solved. And this is something that is in the national interest. Nobody thought this was going to happen. It's a bit like the big bank explosion, isn't it? You know, when the Queen went to Lloyd's and said, why didn't you notice? I mean, why did we not notice that this was happening, that we were living longer, that the working age population was decreasing? And now here we are facing it, and we can no longer ignore it. So you're at the sharp end already, and that end is going to become even sharper. As I've said, I have no stats to furnish you with. I have no provable facts, learned research documents, peer-appreciated definitions of what we should all be doing. What we all know is that it's there, it's happening now, and we, as a nation, have not stepped up to the mark. I thought many of the exchanges that I was privileged to hear post your exercise, which reflected back upon me, as I said when I was cheeky enough to intervene, during my time as a member of Parliament, the advice surgeries that I gave, I think it was 5 every month. And the thing about listening is, and this actually has a reflection on my previous career when I was acting, it's the listening that really gives you the cue. It's not only what people say, it's what they don't say, and you have to be able to listen, but what they're saying may not necessarily be what they mean. And that is a real, it does take time, it takes practice. People can be extremely clever in, I mean, I was very interested in someone who said, because of your time limits, you know, you have someone who doesn't want to stop talking, and yet you have to stop talking because you've got someone else that you have to listen to. The kind of obverse of that is someone who doesn't want to stop talking because they absolutely refuse to believe there is an alternative to their way of viewing their life and what they believe are the solutions to the problems in their life. I mean, the number of times that I've gone through this process where you offer actually quite sensible alternatives, and the absolute refusal on the part of your conversationalist to accept that there is any solution to their problem other than the one that they have decided for themselves. And you think, if only one could turn that energy around, you know, we could transform their lives and the lives of the people around them. And that is, I think, a very hard lesson to learn, that you have to go with the flow with that, because if they are absolute, they're not going to move, and you're just going to make the situation infinitely worse. I've been more depressing in my opening remarks than I intended to be. Because I'm old, and I resent being treated as though I am incompetent, that I no longer have a brain, that I can't think for myself. There may come a point, please God not too soon, where I can't physically do things for myself. And indeed, my brain, I mean, I'm certainly having senior brain moments at the moment. I walk into the kitchen and I stand there and I think, why have I come in here? I was in a supermarket, and I do this all the time, and I'm going around the shelves and I'm thinking, do I want this? No, I don't. This man came up to me and he said, do you talk like this in your kitchen? So I said, probably, yes. He said, my kitchen is beginning to answer me. That hasn't happened to me yet, but it will. I think what I'm really pushing at here is, again, I'm referring back. It must be 10, 15, possibly even longer, when I read a report of a scheme that had been run in Massachusetts, both, I think, local authority and state authority. And of course, in that instance, as in so many instances in this field, the driving agent, the energy, came from the need to save money. And so what they did in Massachusetts, it began very small. I don't quite know how far across the whole state it went. They began to combine services that were already being provided for the elderly and for young children. Many of these children came from single-parent families. The majority of the elderly people may not have had any family members left. And by combining these two extremes of age, the state and the local authorities not only saved money, but the benefits to both of those age groups were actually palpable and accountable, and were of immediate, well, not immediate, but they were of amazing benefit. And I was interested to read that apparently this scheme, this idea, is now being used, I think, in Sweden. I can't remember which other European Union country it is. But that seems to me to be the way of acknowledging that we as a country need, in the same way that we need those guys in the City of London, and we need more doctors and we need more nurses, we need to be able to tap in to the extraordinary amount of valuable experience, knowledge, sheer humanity that is resting in the older generation. A guy who used to help me continually when I was still a member of Parliament at my advice surgeries had been a plumber all his life. He was retired. He'd gone through the whole apprenticeship. It was in the days when, there were such things. And he was much exercised by the failure, as he saw it, and it was correct, to train young people to be plumbers, to be electricians, to be carpenters. I'm going back a couple of decades here. And he was entirely prepared to teach young people, male and female, how to be plumbers. He didn't want any charge. He didn't want to be paid. He simply wanted to pass on, his experience, his information. The bureaucratic nightmare of trying to set that up with a local authority that, in fact, was quite open to this idea was just a nightmare. It was simply not possible. And there are many other areas like that where I think we as a country have to... I don't want old people to be permanently the victim. I don't want this kind of blame culture to constantly be passed around in our society in the way that it is. I'm a woman, we've been victims all my life. When I first went into Parliament, somebody said to me, how are you going to feel in this all-man's club? I said, I'm a woman. That's been my experience all my life. And it was true. We have seen changes there, not nearly enough, not broad enough, not fast enough, but it is too easy, I think, for a society to look upon us as being a burden. And there are dangers inherent in that. I don't want to get down the dying with dignity road in that area, but nonetheless. And actually, if we can only, which is why I thought the exercise you were doing was so valuable and so interesting. If we can only get our older generations to realize that they have within them not only their direct experience, be it either work, family, whatever, but those hidden experiences that it takes some kind of change to bring out of us. My father, who went to sea when he was 11, he was in the Navy, then he was a bricklayer for the rest of his working life. When he had grandchildren, one of the things he did to entertain his grandchildren was to draw for them. And he was an extremely good graphic artist. He had never, ever drawn for any of his 4 daughters, me and my 3 sisters. It had never, ever been something that had occurred to him to do. Partly, of course, because he was working to put food on the table for 4 daughters. But when he got into that age, and I think he was surprised at how good he was at it and how much pleasure it gave to his grandchildren. And you have all seen in the work that you do, I saw it when I used to visit day centres, people being absolutely stunned by what they could actually do if they were only given the opportunity to do it. Be it to sing, be it to dance, be it to draw, be it to paint, be it just to be kind to someone. When I was first a Member of Parliament, we still had something called night schools. That's all gone. And there was this one particular class which only had 5 women in it, and it was a tailoring course. And money again, that had to be taken out, as did the Japanese flower arranging and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, there was a big push from more than just the 5 women who had gone to this class once a week, on the grounds which I thought were irrefutable. One was that one of the members of that group never spoke to another single soul during the week other than possibly the milkman or the postman. Her conversation with other human beings was with this group. Another of their group had learnt English because she was an immigrant, and this was the one place where, as a woman, she could happily sit, talk to other people, and actually learn English. The amount of money that they saved from the costs of the NHS or the costs for teaching English as a second language were arguments that we put forward. I'd like to be able to stand here and say we left the local authority to cheers and a resounding success. Of course we didn't. But this is just another example of we don't know the treasure we have inside ourselves as individuals, and we certainly don't acknowledge as a society the treasure that is residing in us old ones. So thank you for all the work you do. Your work is not going to get any easier. It's going to become infinitely more difficult. But I think the country will be behind you when we get it out of the claws of those party political point-scaring pillocks.
Thanks very much, Glenda. That's great. Right, we open it up to the floor. Have any questions for Glenda at all? Don't
I
be
would
shy.
run, but I'm not that committed. Sorry.
This is where you used to have questions planted. It's like everything I've ever done for schools, you've got to have them.
Thank you so much for that. I don't know whether to call you Miss or Mrs. Jackson, however.
Call me Glenda.
Glenda. I've come from a 35-year... Hiya. I've come from a 35-year clinical background. I did start when I was 3. And I've recently become operational director at Right at Home, and right beside me is the owner of the company. Why have I moved from a clinical background to a social care background? Is because I have a dream. That dream is to smash through the ageist barrier. I was so tired of hearing institutionalized phrases like personal needs, care of the elderly. I mean, who has personal needs? What are they? Do you want to have a wash? Do you not want to have a wash? What can I do for you today? Why I joined the company is what I really loved about it with a passion is that, as I said, the ageist barriers have been broken through. However, there is an ethos of belief that life is for living. Life is fun. I was tired of the doom and gloom of aging populations, demographic statistics, blah, blah, blah. What I'm interested in is people. And I don't do elderly. I don't do the word elderly. What I do is a person that's growing older, like myself. So I thought I'd share that with you because coming from a clinical background, and I can tell you, training needs to be raised. We need to start forgetting about this politicized jargon, you know, that is surrounding. We have to forget about the tick boxes. Yes, we do need to be safe. Yes, our patients, clients, whatever, need to be protected. And yes, Parliament did well with the Mental Capacity Act. It did very well with the Social Care Act. So it did well with the Safeguarding Act. So yes, there has been a lot of movement, but it comes from ground level, and ground level is the art of communication. It's how we talk to people, and the comments from around the floor, I won't go on anymore, but the comments from around the floor have been so fantastic and so rewarding. And I think as a nation, we need to educate our young in how to constantly not look at that phone and to talk. We have a fabulous gift, and that gift is the art of conversation. And we're losing it, and our young are losing it. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. As an erstwhile MP, I'm interested, I'm not, you are, I'm interested in how you feel about consensual politics and whether you think there's any chance of us ever having it. Not long ago, about 3 years, I was at a meeting, and it was Andy Burnham and Stephen Dorrell, and they were both working towards social care, being together, being part of the health service and working together on it. And it was a fabulous meeting, because I thought, oh my God, if politics could be like this, you know, and if we could do this for social care. But I mean, do you think in our lifetimes?
Well, I think it is entirely possible, but I think what you're leaving out of that analogy is the electorate. You know, I mean, it may well be, yes, I've seen it work. I mean, 9 times out of 10, the consensual political decision arises out of some terrible tragedy. But it is feasible, it is possible among politicians themselves. I mean, it isn't, I mean, I'm not a big admirer of the House of Commons, but it isn't a war zone. I mean, you know, MPs of all parties can and do get on with each other. But to go back to what I was referring to earlier about the country having to come to terms with this big black hole that is waiting out there, and, you know, we're either going to be able to grow flowers in it or we're going to fall down to the bottom of the pit. The minute somebody says you may have to lose your house, what's the reaction? I mean, we'd had it before. I think it was floated by the Labour Party in 2007, and the Conservatives then called it the death tax. Oh, that's right. So you can't ignore the realities of what the electorate thinks and feels, and what it feels it may lose or gain. But this is why I say there's this big black hole, and this is why it's good that there was, in my view, this row, because the country has got to take this on board. It's got to face the realities. And it's not going to be easy, and there will be idiots who will try to make party political capital out of it, but let's hope that the majority of us can be sensible and try to see this through to a practical outcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honour to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. My thoughts, I've worked in care policy for many years, so I've been following this story of the funding issue, and I've got so much knowledge in my head about it, actually. I don't even know how to articulate it, because it goes back, I mean, I think there are about 10 different white papers that are related to funding, and you're right, it is a black hole, but I think one of the issues about for the electorate is they don't get it. They don't understand people don't really get what social care is. And how do you, so my question really to you is to first of all, thank you for helping us and articulating it so beautifully, because you are the arch communicator in my view, and you articulate so beautifully. Could you help us as a sector to do a bit more of this communication to the public about the importance of ageing well? So it's not in a kind of social care silo. People don't know anything about the Mental Capacity Act. What does that mean? And how can we kind of almost become better as journalists? I don't know, how do we use your skills about and building bridges? And so it brings the issues alive to people, and we can start lighting fires inside the electric to get this. Do you see? I can't even articulate the question very well, sorry. But do you understand what I'm getting at?
Well, I do. I understand absolutely what you're getting at. And I wish I could stand here and say, that's all right, just form, get out there with a poster and do this kind of thing and do... I go back to the point that I made earlier, that it seems that certain issues only are on the front pages if they're dreadful. I mean, cruelty in an old person's home, that kind of thing gets huge coverage. Why did nobody pick this up? Why did nobody do this? Why did nobody do the other? And when that all calms down and goes away, then it's all forgotten again. There are sacred cows in our society. The NHS is one. So if we really want to tackle this subject, and as I said, it has gone up the political flagpole, then we have to get away from this. That's the NHS. Yeah. This is social care. And it's going to be very, very hard to do. But it is doable. It has to be doable. But that, in one sense, is only going to be doable on the issue of money. And it's all going to come down to money in the end. What we, as a grown-up society, have to come to terms with is how do we pay for it? There isn't some white knight that's going to come galloping over the mountains with bags of gold all either side of the horse. We have to say, do we as a society think this is justified for our older generation? For example, I had a constituent. He had 2 carers. He was on his own. They were there at 7 o'clock in the morning to get him up, make sure he got the food, that kind of thing. They put him to bed at 7 o'clock at night. Now that's absolutely outrageous. Not on their part. I mean, they weren't being cruel. That was the system. And so it's those kinds of things, of people being left on their own. One of the things that I got as an MP, which people really, really objected to, and I'll paraphrase what I got from a variety of people, was I never knew who's going to be outside the door when I answer the bell. There was always a different person, a different face, not unusual, not more than occasionally at a different time. And these are the people who are carrying the burden of this. And as you all know, as we all know, they're badly paid. I mean, so it's much bigger than finding one easy, soundbite or something like that. The country has to grow up and be mature enough to say, yes, we wouldn't allow this, although we do in some instances, allow this to happen to babies. We're not going to allow this to happen to our geriatrics. And there's a big, big place, I think, for those of us who, thank God and touch wood, still are hale and hearty, and yet have the decades that we've actually lived, to argue against this view that all of us who are old are useless and just a burden.
Thank you very much. I think it is about building bridges Absolutely. With people in the arts and who've got influence and who can speak out the stories from, because we got the stories and being able to help us, I think, empower, I suppose, bring out our voices really as well.
I mean, just before you finish, I mean, someone was saying earlier, the tick the boxes thing, and people who announce who they are. I think you were saying it. But again, this goes back, this is reflected in absolutely every aspect of our national life. I don't care what it is. If it's a human voice at the end of the phone, whoever you're ringing, and it's becoming increasingly rare that there's a human voice at the end of the phone, it's probably a recorded one that says, if you want to know this, you all know it, I don't need to go through all the numbers. But you ask if it's a human voice a question that isn't on their tick box. They have no answer. They don't know. That's not their fault. It's because whoever sits up there in the boardroom does not pay enough time, attention and money for the training of the first public contact their firm, their business, whatever it is, has with the general public. That's the first. That's turning the key in the lock. And that's something else we as a country are going to have to learn to do.
So, Glenda, how can we change this? Because what's happening is care is in crisis. Care is in crisis. We as carers are like the bottom. How do we change that?
Well, I mean, absolutely, I agree with everything you've just said. And it's very easy for me to stand here and say, well, you just have to keep on doing. But that, in effect, is what we all have to do. We have to keep on doing. Because you also, as care workers, you suffer from the tragedies. You know, I mean, do I need to go through the list of children, Victoria Climbié, Baby P, all that? That gets huge, huge coverage. And that is justifiably so. I mean, so it should. But we delude ourselves if we think all those inquiries, the research, actually bring about the kind of fundamental changes that we should be talking about. Because there is always someone with a sadder story somewhere else, and it is always automatically assumed that the only response is more money. Well, in many instances it is, and I mean, this is one of the areas where it is. But it's more than that, because it is accepting our responsibilities as a society. And in a way, I think many, for example, the charities that work in this area, I mean, I think the charities that work in practically every area of our national life should be more seriously looking at how they come together. I mean, how they become a really big voice, and not, because I hope I'm not going to offend anyone here, but some of the bigger organizations that work in this area are very territorially directed. They don't want to work with other people. They don't want to share what they know. Well, I'm sorry, but I think we're going to have to. And that may be one of the first steps. But the really big conversations are waiting for us all, so we'd better get hold of the rule book.
Thank you very much, Glenda, for joining us. And I just wanted to ask you, how hopeful are you about private businesses getting involved in supporting grassroots projects? And for instance, with the corporate social responsibility thing that seems to be coming through a lot, I myself, as somebody who's organised activities for older people, have noticed a kind of a missed opportunity to engage the hearts of people who do come in and want to give their time. It's far easier to get help for painting houses or making gardening projects, but when it comes to kind of connecting, which is what this whole Flourishing Lives is about, and promoting that, I feel that there could be more done either through if they're going to spend time, that time is better directed somehow to be really useful. But when it's one-off, it's kind of a drop in the ocean. But perhaps if there was a way that if businesses really did want to contribute to society, and they get a lot of good press for that, and they shout about it on their websites, if perhaps they could put their money where their mouth is and perhaps start plugging our hole that is money to social care.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the amount of money that's going to be needed is really, really going to be enormous. We really haven't looked at this seriously. I mean, if you just think of the numbers that have been floated around over the past couple of weeks, I mean, really, 75,000 cap on social care. Who are they kidding? 75,000 when already people are paying double that for their care. But I mean, don't get me started on that. So, to come back to your point about the engagement with big companies, I think yes, big companies do, because they know that it does have benefits for them. they tend to try to keep it apolitical, which is quite wise of them, by having, this is our charity this year. Do you know what I mean? But there was, I mean, it is possible, I think, to engage people more, and as always, it comes quite often from individuals, but also I think smaller businesses would be happy to engage locally. I mean, they're not going to get into that whole area of, you know, nationally we need to change this. You can go to, you know, your local small business council or whatever they are, I can't remember the formal names now, and say, look, as we did in my part of London a few years ago now, we want to save this little bit of the park because this is a nice place for elderly people to be able to sit down, and there's a special breed of butterfly that likes it as well. So you've got kind of two things covered. You were doing something that was social for the elderly, and you were also showing you were green. So that was good. And small, you know, I mean, we talk about small businesses. We're actually talking about I don't know what the tick box number is, but it can be between 30 or 50 people. But it can also be the guy who's the local newsagent on the corner, if you sell it to them, you know, well enough. And I think that is a way of engaging with what you put your finger on, which is very important, which is the conversation. And this goes back to the point that I was making. We have to tap in to our existing elderly population and say, what have you got inside yourself that could help us to link up with whatever it is we're trying to do now? And that information is out there, but people have to be told that their knowledge is required. Do you see what I mean? It ain't an easy future, that's for sure. The one good thing, actually, which I've suddenly realised is that people are going to have to work far, far longer than they do now before they can get their state pension or anything like that. So, you know, maybe the workforce will increase.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Can I just pick up on a lovely phrase that you said at the end, Glenda, about discovering the treasures in people? And I just want to do a little plug, if I may, for an exhibition that I'm curating in June as part of London Creativity and Wellbeing Week, which I hope will do just that, discovering the treasures in potters that I teach in and around London and Surrey, in care homes. They're all aged between 70 and 102. So there'll be about 30 of them being exhibited. Some of them have never done pottery before. Some of them have done pottery when they were kids at school and come into the class and say, oh yeah, I was never very good at that. I think, well, should we try again 70 years later? And they discover a real talent. So yeah, there's about 30 of them exhibiting in Pimlico. I've got some posters if anyone wants some information about it.
That's also, I think, what is very important is that there is something tangible.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, that there's something that you can hold, you can see, you can read, you can hear.
Yeah, and they all have a story. Each object is, you know, made by the maker and has a real story behind why they've made it, and so it should be good.
I mean, I'm quite snooty about all this. When I was first approached to do this, and it was sold on the idea of the arts, you know, engaging in this, and I said, hang on a minute, art is not entertainment. You know, the creative arts are not entertainment. They're bloody hard work, and performing arts are even harder, but at least their boundaries are defined before you get started. But this idea of finding that thing inside us all, because we do have it. I mean, as I say, sometimes it only comes out in a moment of high crisis, but there is stuff in there, and it is just releasing it and, you know, getting over that thing of people saying, oh, I was never good at this at school or something like that. We were all lousy at school. We didn't want to be there.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Recently you went back to the stage to play Lear, and I wondered how you found it as a person, as a female playing a male role, but also as someone older now. Were there any insights? And you must have had such a overwhelming feeling of power afterwards. I'd like to hear a little more about your experience, please.
Why would I I have an overwhelming feeling of power. He's died. His daughters are all dead. The country that he had has just been blown up to pieces. Anyway, put that. That's the plot. Put that to one side. There were two major. Let me put it another way. My interest when it was proposed to me that I do Lear, and I said to the person who said it to me, hang on, I've got to sit down for a minute. But because, as I said to her, she'd done it in Spain, and I said, they'd never let me do Lear in England. I said, a woman doing Lear, are you crazy? Anyway, the old Vic they took the chance, God bless them. But what I found interesting, because I wasn't interested in the kind of gender bender thing, I think we're over that fence now. But what I did find interesting, because I have seen it, and it's the way the gender barriers begin to fracture, to fray, to become much, much thinner as we get older. And we're talking about he says he's 80 in the play, and that was at a time when, I think life expectancy was 45, so 80 then is a lot older than 80 now. And you do see this. I mean, you don't have the same gender barriers with babies, for instance, and I see those gender barriers beginning, as I've said, to dissolve almost as we get older and older. So that I found interesting. I never ever thought about it, actually, up front. And of course, one of the amazing things about being in the theatre is that you cannot see people for donkey's years and you bump into each other and as though you've just come out of the same room. I mean, it's very bizarre and marvellous, that aspect of it. So there was that whole thing. I hadn't believed it would be as simple as it was, like walking out of one room into another, but it was. And of course, the best gym in the world is a Shakespeare play. I mean, my overwhelming fear, quite apart from not being able to act it, was that I wouldn't be vocally or physically strong enough to do it. And of course, the only days that I really felt exhausted were Sundays when we didn't play. So there you go.
Thank you.
Hi, it's interesting you just mentioned Lear, and I went to see on the screen Antony and Cleopatra last night, and I think that, I suppose one of the things I want to hold, which is difficult, we're talking about flourishing lives, and I think it's really important we help people live very fully. But there is also that whole existential bit about confronting the fact that people are getting older and are having to confront the fear of dying. And I think sometimes, someone mentioned earlier when we're talking about communication, the importance of listening to what people aren't saying and how honest we can be with our own fears about loneliness. We're extending that period of flourishing life, which is great. But actually, for many of us and many people we work with, there is going to be that moment when their lives are no longer flourishing. And I think on some ways, we've got to, there's an and, isn't there? There's not a but, it's an and. We're working with people to help them make the most of their lives, and we have to confront the whole issues around, what is those last times when, which, I'm not saying this very, very clearly, but I think we have to hold the despair and the difficulties as well as holding the living life fully. And I just think we just need to hold on to that. And thank you for, King Lear is a good example of how we face some of those difficult questions that people want to be thinking about. We started with the 11 o'clock, didn't start, but we had the 11 o'clock moment of silence. I was in the project the other morning, and we had a radio group planned, which was going to be listening to music, etc. And someone said, "Look, I can't face this. We've just had this event. We've got to talk about this." So we had an hour and a half of just being with, and we actually started off with, I was able to access Jacqueline Dupray's Bruch Kol Nidra music on YouTube. And we just spent 10 minutes just listening to this, and then from that leading into a really moving exploration about religion and death and mourning and what it means and community. and it was very, very important. So let's have the difficult conversations as well as the easier ones.
But isn't it just that Lear, isn't it, you know better than I do, but isn't it, oh, let me not be mad? Isn't it the madness that, it's not so much the age, is it, with him? Because he has so much power, or believes he has. It's his fear of madness.
Well, in a strange kind of way, yes, I mean, that's true, because he is physically fearless. I mean, he doesn't fear in that way. But he is afraid of being mad, but it's not simply on that level of, oh God, you're taking me back and I'm trying to be, it's easier to act it than to talk about it. What I'm trying to say here is that there are so many things within his fear of madness which has to do with guilt. He's beginning to realize what he did. He's beginning to realize that what he had believed his daughters were, they are not. There is so much coming in, and which is why, you know, the storm scene is him literally letting off steam. I mean, that's the rage and the fury and the grief as well. But I think we make too much. Mad is a word that has lost its meaning in our society, in our generation now, in the same way that gay is a word that you use in a completely different context. So, you know, one has to be, we tend to think of mad as being just angry. That isn't what it's meant in that word at all. There's an awful lot piled into it. So I think I did that on stage. I can't remember now.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Just one more. Yeah. Thank you. That's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. It's a question for you, perhaps from your constituency, but also to the room. I'm from Rumbere, and we open our classes for people with dementia and Parkinson's. We also have classes for older adults, which Katie does most of the work for. We're just looking at expanding our programme and specifically working with adults who are isolated and dealing with isolation and loneliness. And I just wondered how, it's by the very nature of someone being categorised like that, are we sure that we know who they are? How do we access those people who are isolated and lonely before it's too late? You know, I think that's something that I feel very passionately about, that we're not just going to the people that we know, but the people that we perhaps don't know who are starting to feel isolated and lonely. And I know that working with charities and social care communities and organisations is one way in, but I just wondered what the experience for others was and how you engage with those people and how you identify them.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it's very difficult to come up with a solution that's going to meet all the problems you're talking about. Because let me put it as a direct experience. When I was first campaigning to win a seat in Hampstead and Highgate, I'm going back now to 1992, I was told not to bother with one part of my constituency because they were all big houses, they were all going to vote Conservative. Why would I waste my time knocking on the door? My agent for that campaign said, it's the first time out, that's going to be one of the first things you're going to be criticised. So it is no exaggeration to say I knocked on every single door in Hampstead and Highgate during that campaign. And the area that I had been told not to bother with, because they were all big houses and they were all going to vote Conservative, when the inhabitant did respond to the knock on the door, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say 9 times out of 10, it was an elderly woman on her own who was rapidly outliving her income in this huge house which she couldn't maintain, but pride would never ever have allowed her to ask for help. Now, how do you afford people like that the help that they need? The churches are marvellous, absolutely marvellous. I say churches, what I mean is the entire religious community, regardless of what religion may be practicing. They know extremely well where those people are. I think also, I mean, over the years I saw the day centres, the provision that Camden was giving to the elderly for whatever, the day centres closing or being incorporated or moving somewhere else, they must still have records. And it may be possible that they could afford you, or it might be against the Data Protection Act, I don't know, it probably will be. But there will be people. But I think the churches, I think local shops as well. I would say to you post offices, but of course they've gone as well. The other one is libraries, but they've probably gone as well. But the kind of infrastructure, if you look at a small area, just look at it and see what the shops are, all that kind of thing. Very often, you know, newspaper shops maybe, or just have a look that's there. But the first thing I would go for would be the churches, for the religious organisations, because they really do know.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I just say chemists? Yes. Chemists, they have to do the delivery of prescription for people.
Yeah, I mean, again, they're rapidly going, but I mean, yes, chemists. But again, you have to be careful because of the Data Protection Act. And if they're not too busy, the local police might be able to help you as well. But you are going to run up against pride, and
Yes.
that's personal.
Yeah.
Thanks, Glenda. I should actually say that a workshop on kind of reaching those kind of socially isolated people is something that we're working on with Flourishing Lives and delivering later in the year as well. And we were speaking with Ruth at V&A about that, and Flo Schroeder at Royal Albert Hall as well. So, yeah, that is something we're working on. So we'll be a part of that. But yeah, thanks so much, Glenda, for coming and speaking to us. Your force and clarity of communication is an absolute inspiration to us all.
Well, thank you for
So
inviting
thank you.
me. You're doing the hard work, not me. Thank you
Yeah,
very
so I'd just like
much.
to say thank you very much.